Welcome, everyone, to Going D1 Real Recruiting Stories with Joel Grun and Gunnar Grun. We're excited to be joined by Bruce Donaldson, a good friend of mine from years ago in London, one of the first people to see Gunnar after his birth, ironically. So anyways, great to have you here, Bruce. Thanks so much. We're going to be talking about his son Deacon, who went to West Point to play D1 lacrosse. So we're excited to have you. Thanks again for doing this, and hopefully, we can keep the questions and answers short enough for you, so we can get through and you can get on to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, no. Hey, look, all good. And coming out of the shoot, I better make it clear that I also have a daughter, Dagny, who is a D1 swimmer. So I would be remiss if we didn't give her, equal or more pub, because I'm sure one of the things we're going to talk about is athletic talent, and I think she won the lottery on that one.
Where did she go to school for that?
So Dagny is a sophomore swimmer at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and as Joel mentioned, our eldest son Deacon just graduated from West Point, where he played lacrosse.
Awesome. That's awesome, because we, as Gunnar told me, we've been a little football heavy, so love to hear both their stories and get away from the football and baseball stories. So that's right. Awesome. So tell us, basically you and I lived in London for years after graduate school, and you had a number of kids. We had some kids, and tell us a little bit about you and your and Megan's sort of, I guess, athletic story, and kind of what you were what the goal was, or the possible opportunity for the kids, and kind of your approach with possibly their talents, as they all have different talents, and that'd be great to kind of get a picture of that. So
yeah, so look, by way of introduction, to orient the conversation, Megan, my wife and partner of I think it's 34 years now, was I think like a 9-time All-American swimmer in Division III. So she was a great athlete. I played some lacrosse when I was younger, and we had 4 kids. And so coming into, raising our kids, sports was a heavy part of our life, each of our lives growing up. And for us, it was important that we gave them exposure to a wide range of sports, really for 2 reasons. One, each of our kids shares the same genes, but they couldn't be more different in many ways, as I'm sure any parent who listens to this knows. It is a miracle how different the kids can come out, notwithstanding the fact they have the same parents. But I would say more importantly, we always viewed athletics as a very important component of the maturation process of growing up. Like all failed athletes, I'll speak for myself, not Megan. You always have dreams that your kids are going to grow up and be better athletes than you were, and in my case, that's easy because all of them have become better athletes than I was. But we didn't introduce them to sports, play sports in the backyard, support them through their journeys, because we had a vision around necessarily using sports to get into schools or develop a professional career. It was really to become more well-rounded people. And, as kids transition into the quote unquote real world, as any parent knows, you're going to get knocked down. Like, that is just a fact of life. And, what Megan and I learned through our experiences was not how successful you were on any given day, but when you got knocked down, like, what were you going to do with that? Were you going to get back up and keep swinging? And I think sports just generally is key to developing that life skill, which is critically important. The journeys we have 4 kids. Deacon just graduated from West Point, as we talked about. Dagny is a sophomore swimmer at Lehigh University. We have a son, Dante, who plays football wrestles. In high school, he's a junior, and our baby Dominique is a sophomore swimmer and dancer. And so that's kind of where we're at. So we've had two either in or out of college, both of whom were Division I athletes, and two that are, heavily into sports, competitively to try and develop their careers. And maybe certainly one or two of them are thinking about, taking the next step and doing what they do in college. But, two in high school who haven't gone on the journey yet.
Wow. I have a question about, if you, I just learned that you knew me when I was in London. And so obviously you and Megan have lived in Europe. In terms of having or knowing that you wanted your kids to be part of athletics and grow in that athletic sphere, did you know that you were going to move to the US to have sort of more diverse opportunities in terms of sports for them, or did you start that out in Europe, or how did you kind of view the I guess like the athletic scene in England versus in the US?
Yeah, so there are way more opportunities, I think, athletically in the States. It is a great melting pot, and there's so many different sports that you can play. Just being honest, though, that the decision around whether to move back to the U.S. or not had nothing to do with athletics. It did have everything to do with family. And other than a strong affinity for the Buffalo Bills, it's easier to watch them when I'm back in the U.S. as opposed to being in London. That was more of a lifestyle choice for Megan and I, where we wanted to raise our family.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about, I guess, the process around both Deacon and Dagny. I don't know the swimming. I know lacrosse fairly well in terms of recruiting, but I don't know the swimming world at all. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of each of their kind of high school experiences, and then kind of the process? I'm guessing swimming has like big national meets and that kind of thing, and so there's inherent exposure, but lacrosse is very different. If you could tell us a little bit about those sports from a firsthand perspective rather than from my limited lacrosse from a distance perspective.
Well, yeah. So I think, lacrosse is, as everyone knows, is really blowing up as a sport and offers great opportunities both on the men's side and the women's side, but two completely different journeys. So lacrosse, for those listeners that are not that familiar, it is very much a team game. Basketball concepts on offense, the physicality of football for sure, being able to decleat people or hit them with a stick, and a lot of the technical skill from hockey. But as a team-based sport,
so it's basically the best sport. Is it? I just want to jump in. It's the best sport.
So unequivocally, and any sport that allows somebody like me to play at a reasonably high level with my limited athletic ability, yes, for sure, it creates a lot of
opportunity. All right.
Yeah, let's get that out of there.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we should get a couple things off. Yeah, we should get a couple things off the table. So one, limited athletic ability on my end. And two, Joe, you and I both have one thing in common, and that's our kids are infinitely better athletes than we ever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so let's just get that out of the way.
Yeah, no doubt.
No, so lacrosse is really a team sport, and I mentioned that because, as you think about going through, high school. And it starts even before high school. So the recruiting rules for high school were just for college were just changed a couple of years ago. It used to be able to recruit 8th graders and below. There was no limit. Now you can't start recruiting until the junior year. But as a team-based sports, there's lots of clubs. So the idea of these elite clubs and specialized training facilities, just like you have in football and baseball, that is fully evolved on the lacrosse side. And given the historic East Coast base and high net worth, all the money that's put into those programs, that recruiting process is as well developed as football or baseball, but it's a team-based thing. And so how do you stand out and catch the eye of college coaches when you're playing a team-based sport where in any given day, in any given game, in any given play. The right play may be to make the pass that leads to the assist that leads to the goal that doesn't get on the stat sheet. But you're worried that, if I make that smart play, do the coaches notice me, or do I just go to the goal because this is my chance to, show off? And so that whole recruiting process around lacrosse is very different, and probably something that the parents that listen to this are familiar with. Like, how do we stand out? What do we do? Do we work with specialized coaches? Do we go the club program? Do we stick with the local town program? Do we go to public high school? Do we go to private? Like, that all exists and is fully developed on the lacrosse side. On the swimming side, the analogy is to track. Like, as my wife is fond of saying, numbers don't lie. And what she loved about swimming is she didn't have to ask people if she was better than the person in the lane next door. All she had to do was beat them, and she knew. And so the recruiting process on the swimming side is very different. It's very times-based. Now, the coaches there, they've got to look. That time is just a snapshot in time, where people heavily in the training, and so they haven't tapered to try and get the high score. So you got to parse through some of the numbers. Were they using tech suits? There's been an evolution in swim gear, maybe not as impactful as some of the technology on the stick side or other sports that you have, but all those things go on. But it is much more an objective process, whereas lacrosse is really more subjective. And so, each of the kids had different journeys in that regard, and we can talk about, because I was, the guy that was sort of quarterbacking that for my kids, what their individual processes were like. The only other thing I would say is, not only did Dagny, who was the swimmer, have an objective process to go through, whereas Deacons was much more subjective and team-based, but Dagny as an athlete developed very early on. She was winning all her races, like, from the jump. And Deacon was a great athlete, in grade school, but the maturation side, on the for men starts at different times in different ways. And so, he sort of matured later in life, which meant that from a physicality standpoint, in middle school coming into high school, he was long, but he was not mature. He hadn't started popping from a muscle standpoint. And so his journey, he was a walk-on. So Dagny was a recruited Division I athlete. Deacon was a walk-on, and we can talk about the lessons there in each of their individual processes. But I just want to kind of set the table that even though they came from the same parents, two very different experiences and approaches going into that college recruiting process.
Awesome. Thank you. And tell us a little bit about, so with the swimming, I feel like, you get involved, you can go to the YMCA or whatever, the local club, and you start winning races, and then you get an invitation, or your coach says, hey, how about racing here? And you win those, and then they're like, hey, how about what racing? Is that kind of the process? Like, it's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah,
you win, you elevate, further, etc.
You go from local events to regional events to national events. You can be with your local Y team. Like, the great thing about swimming is, at the end of the day, socioeconomic backgrounds, academic records, what privileges you have, what you don't have, none of that stuff matters. How'd you do in the pool? How'd you do head to head? And what's your trajectory like? And do they look at the size of the swimmer? Like, being 6'4" is better than being 5'8"? Sure. But at the end of the day, like, you get in the pool and you can go or you can't. So from a recruiting perspective, Dagny, Dagny was used to winning. Like that, great, I don't know what it's like, but firsthand, but secondhand. And so she just, she loved the work. She loved being on the team. She was in sports for, all the relationships that she built. And when you're winning, that's a great thing to do, because, it's just easier when you're
fun.
winning.
It's fun. It's fun to win.
Recruiting for her did not start until after her junior year of high school. So we went all the way through, October, November. We got into April, when she completed the state meet. She ended up being the number one ranked, first team All-State 100 freestyler in New Jersey, which, while it's not California and Florida, like, Jersey's got a lot of really good swimming. But for her, the process, what I told her is hang the numbers, in the pool, have a great year, do the best that you can in getting ready for the SATs. But until you get through your numbers, let's not even do it. But once we had the numbers, we had the SATs, we knew what our grade point was, and we had our numbers in the pool. Then, and my question to her was, do you want to swim Division I, which is that's a tough sport at a college level, double sessions, 2 hours, most of the
Yeah.
days.
Like
It's
6,
a grind,
7 hours in the pool, right?
for sure. Do you want to do that? And we talked a little bit about that. And then the other question I asked her is like, do you want to use your swimming, because she was going to be recruited as a way to get into a better academic school. I don't think she ever had aspirations of trying to go to an Olympic level or get any sort of sponsorship, NIL, any of that stuff. So she was not at that, ultra high Division I level.
Right.
But the choice that she made was to say, okay, I want to do the Division I swimming, and if it can help me get into, a large school with great academics, maybe that's sort of, an opportunity that I may not get on my own if I didn't have swimming as a part of my overall admissions package, I'm up for that. And so, as the quarterback for her, once we got those numbers, it was pretty easy. We ranked every single Division I school that offered a swimming program. And then we started knocking schools out by, are they too elite from like a Division I level? So, as much as she maybe liked to go to UVA or Texas, she was not going to swim there. And she wanted to swim in college. So we took out about the top 20 schools. Then we also decided that there were certain academic standards or majors that she was looking for. So we knocked out a bunch of schools from did they offer the right sorts of majors? Did they have the right sort of career development? Did they offer study abroad or other sorts of programs? So we knocked out a bunch of schools. And then we were left with 50 universities and colleges that, she was interested in. And so we went through each of them. She and I just talked and explained to them my view, and then we sort of whittled that list down to about 35. And so she had 35 schools that she was potentially very interested, had never taken a college trip. I didn't want my kids to get to, hey, look, if you take
It's
your kid
exciting, right?
on a trip as a freshman to, UCLA or Texas or, Alabama,
Yeah.
they're going to, of course, they'll be like, yeah, I want to play here. And that may not be realistic for them. And so
Yeah.
I didn't want my kids to fall into that.
Right.
So we knocked out 35 letters. It just happened that Lehigh was literally the first one to respond. Out of the 35 letters we sent, we got 12 letters of interest, a couple of, ghosts, and a bunch like, hey, at this time, we're not interested. Great. Now we got 12 schools to focus on. It turned out that not only was Lehigh the first university to respond, but it was also her first recruiting trip. She had 3 lined up. She went to the school, she fell in love, and it was the easiest recruiting process in the world. And I think she told the coach that she was coming before he said, we want you to come, but that's Debbie. and so that, from a recruiting perspective, was, that was a very efficient journey because we put the work in first.
Right.
We manage our kids' expectations about how and when they should engage. In swimming,
Right.
it's all numbers based. Don't even worry about it until you get through your junior year and you start hanging your real numbers. And then once she got that first team All-State, you can well imagine that featured at the top of the letter in a resume. And then we just went on the offensive, and I think within inside of 6 months, the whole thing was sorted out, and it was great.
Wow. That's incredible. That's so fast. It's crazy.
Sorry, I got something. Do you, she's the second oldest, right?
Yep.
Okay. So do you feel like going through the process with Deacon before with lacrosse helped you to come up with such like an organized plan for Dagny and helped you kind of learn about the process? Or do you think that those two sports are so different that it was a whole different ordeal?
So I would say very different, but with one big learning. As a parent, and Gunnar, hopefully you'll have the opportunity to experience this, having kids are the greatest highs and the lowest lows. And I got more nervous watching my kids play their sport than I got, when I was about ready to go on the field.
I've heard that. I've heard that lots of times from my parents.
And so the hardest thing for a parent when you want to just pour yourself into your kid's journey, I would say, and everybody has their own philosophy, like you can almost do your kids a massive disservice by getting too into the recruiting process too early. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule. I would love to raise a 6'6", 320-pound, fast twitch D tackle that Nick Saban is going to call up and say, we got to have your kid. That's the exception. So if most of us are dealing with the norm, like you don't want you to get your kids too amped up around what the coach was trying to imply when he looked at you from the side. Like you haven't, like that whole, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade thing, like most kids haven't fully developed. They're not emotionally equipped to go on that journey. Parents get way too competitive. Joel, you've been on the sidelines, that whole thing. I've never talked to parents at summer lacrosse games or tournaments or high school games. Like I sat by myself because I just didn't want to put myself through the roller coaster and then have that bleed over into my kid. So with Dagny, even though that was a very objective process, I would say the one great learning that I took from Deacon's experience was don't start them too early. Get them, swimming, you got to figure out what the recruiting process like and be like track and field, all those sports that's based on a number. Until you know what your numbers are, it doesn't mean you can't have aspirations about improving your numbers, but don't expose, hey, am I going to go to Clemson, right? Like that, I think just creates too much attitude. Deacon's journey was completely different, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that in a second.
So, thank you. That's extremely helpful. Bruce, I'll commend you for great wisdom and, patience and good work on that, because it's very infrequent that that I speak to parents that have kind of a well-adjusted view of it. And I will say that part of it is you downplay your lacrosse success, but being successful yourself in a sport helps you to have less of an axe to grind in terms of having your kids succeed. So I think a lot of times I've noticed that's very helpful. But that aside, back to the swimming. So I've had friends that have swam, for different Division I programs. I don't know too many kids that are doing it, but my understanding is that there's, similar to track and field, there are schools that have very specific times for every different event that you're either in or out of that bucket. And so the recruiting process is actually fairly straightforward, right? You can beg the coach, but they're just going to say, hey, you're never going to compete for us, sort of thing. Or vice versa, you could have a school that really wants you and you're bringing so much to the team that it could be a great fit for you, but you have to recognize your team is not at that same level. Is that the right way to look at it, or is there a lot more margin for improvement within each athlete's performance?
Yeah, so in those time-based sports, the way the colleges recruit is they will publish standards on their websites. Like if you're not at this level, like
don't talk to us.
Yeah, pretty much. Now the flip side is we didn't go out to whatever it is, 100 or 130, colleges and universities that offer women's swimming at a Division I level. I forgot what the number is. Like we were very intentional around what we did. So once we found those schools that from a time perspective and an academic perspective and a geography and size of school and majors and all those sort of things, we became very intentional around those 35. And I would argue, which ultimately, led to, I think, 12 or 13 opportunities to engage. When Dagny showed up at Lehigh for her first recruiting trip, like she was dialed in.
Right.
She had done her work. She knew the alumni. She knew the majors. She had talked to people, experienced the campus life. It was a mid-sized school. Like it's probably one of the smallest universities that offers a full suite of Division I athletics, and arguably, for a mid-sized school, one of the best athletic programs you go, and a campus Where like Joel, when you and I were back on campus, like if you were playing a varsity sport, you were the man on campus. Today, that student body mix has changed a little bit, and being an athlete sometimes is not necessarily as cool as it used to be. At Lehigh, they
We need
revere
to go
their
back.
they revere their athletes, and so she had done her work, and so when it's set up, like she was in a position to say, "This is what I want. I've done the work. I know what I'm looking for." And when the opportunity came up, like, but she hit the bid, and I would contrast that to somebody who approaches it like a shotgun style. All right, I got all the numbers. Now I'm going to send all the letters out, and I'm going to play like the pachinko machine. Who's going to give me the most scholarship money? Who's going to get my kid in early? Who's going to give me NIL? Who's going to introduce me to alumni? And then I'm going to, as the parent, I'm going to start trading with the various coaches like my kid is a piece of property, and which
Sure.
is and with NIL coming in, it's even worse now. Think about all the things that are in there, and I think I would argue the reason you don't want to take that shotgun approach and then pachinko machine and whittle them down is I think you're much better off from a long-term happiness standpoint, helping the child figure out, okay, what are the things I'm looking for? What do I want?
Right.
And then laser in on those. And if it doesn't work out, well, hey, life doesn't always work out. But if you get the offer, now you're not in a position, well, yeah, Lehigh made me an offer, but I'm still waiting to hear from Duke or Harvard or whatever. Like,
Right.
if those schools weren't in your top 25, why are you going to start retrading them on the way through when it may not be a good fit? So be really intentional around what your child is looking for. And Gunnar, I mean, I'm sure you can appreciate this because you grow like 17-year-olds, they think they got the world wired, but the reality is there's a hell of a lot of learning that goes on from 17 to 25.
Yeah.
And that's when you start getting perspective, and helping your kids figure out what they're looking for, I think, is the most important thing, even in an objective-based recruiting process like you have with swimming or track or field.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's great that a sport like swimming or track and field is able to offer that sort of clarity in terms of like whittling down the schools to where your child fits in. Did you find that was a lot tougher to do with lacrosse?
The lacrosse journey was completely different. So we can
well, wait, before we switch to lacrosse, I have one last question that I think is Gunnar has had a major journey of velocity with pitching, and I had a journey of, I would say, athleticism and jumping ability and speed myself, where in high school I was at a certain level, and then you get to college and you're like, oh man, I could jump much higher than I could in high school, and I'm faster. So there's a dynamic of improvement for some athletes and not for others. And so with the swimming, I guess in my mind, I'm thinking if I had a swimmer child, I would be saying, how do I get their performance at a higher level? And was there a lot of, did you put resources, whether it's financial or time or whatever, into incrementally improving her speeds or times or techniques? Or was it was more of a standardized process? How did you approach that? And I'm sure Megan had tremendous input in technique and all sorts of things that may have helped from an early age. So I guess the real question is, do you feel that in the swimming process, a middle school, high school athlete, even a college athlete, is there tremendous opportunity for improvement, or did you approach it as, hey, this is where you're at, and let's just accept that and figure out your spot from there?
Well, one, Megan made many contributions, but I think the swimming DNA was probably the most important because she was an awesome swimmer, and so I think Dagny had that gift naturally from her mom. She had that natural physical ability. If you're asking me, and this will be more relevant when we talk about lacrosse journey, I would say I'm not a big one on, hey, here's the natural ceiling. Like I don't have many skills, but punching through the ceiling has always been one of them. And to me, that's as much a mental attitude as anything. The trick as a parent is that's not going to happen if it doesn't start with the kid first. Like you can't instill heart in your child, and you can't instill joy of the sport long term. The great differentiator, at least at the college level, and I could probably even argue at the professional level, like if you don't love what you're doing, no amount of lifting weights and running sprints and all that crap is going to help you if in the day you don't love it, because that will become the great separator at the college level. Dagny's journey had its ups and downs. There was a period when, she was very much a self-starter. She loved it, but she got to a period where she got burned out when she jumped headlong into, I think it was her sophomore year at the elite club level. Like she got a little burned out, and we had some time on the couch, each of Megan and I talking to her around what she wanted to do. And there were some times when we were probably, encouraging her or nudging her to, double down on her efforts, but never trying to make it about us, trying to make sure that, if you run into a wall, is this a temporary setback, or is there a bigger issue here that you've lost your passion because you don't want to overrun, your kids and mistake one for the other. So we helped her, with the downs when the ups and downs of any athletic career occur. But yeah, there are resources available. We did get our specialized coach here in New Jersey, who was great for her senior year. It worked. He worked with her on her technique. It wasn't coming from, mom or dad. It wasn't coming from her club coach. It wasn't coming from her high school coach or any of your teammates. It was coming from a professional coach who got in the pool. And I give the guy, Nick, just great credit for the way he handled that. And it was a few tweaks, and I think it helped her rediscover her joy and improve. So on the margins, that absolutely is there. And we made sure that she had the resources that she needed, so long as she was the one that wanted them.
Yeah.
Right.
And that was the most important thing that we focused on.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to reiterate, I guess, what you said is you are not a believer in a natural ceiling, and that you've experienced punching through that ceiling yourself, and you're a big believer in that. And I think in my mind, that was one of the things I learned about myself in college was, there's not a natural ceiling that people were telling me all the time when I was growing up. And I think that's been extremely helpful for Gunnar and Bowden to have a view that, there's not a natural ceiling that we're fighting against. So
I think you got to be grounded in reality. But my son Dante is going through this, right now. He's 6'2". He finished his sophomore year at wrestling season about 200 pounds, and he wants to play defensive end at a Division I level. And his coaches are like, yeah, that's never going to happen. And so he put the work in. He got up to 245 by the start of football season, and he had a great year. Now he's not 6'6" and he's not 320. Those are facts of life. The ceiling there is, I can't tell him he's going to grow to be 6'6", and if he does, maybe he can hang 320 pounds on the frame, that TBD. But so you got to be based in reality. But the great thing about football, as a team game, it's not a bench contest. It's not a 40-yard dash contest, right? When you get in the trenches, and I never was. So I don't speak like with a voice of authority. Like, there's an attitude in there, and he may not have the height and the weight, but he's got the attitude and he's got the quicks. And so he has figured out how to apply the gifts that God's given him to that particular situation. And, you know, he had a game this fall. Kid had just committed to the University of Maryland as a left tackle. And there were a couple plays where that he was 6'7", like 280 or 290, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And Dante was a D end, and there were a couple plays when that kid got his both hands on Dante, and he went backwards and he ended up on the ground.
Wow.
And that, you know, that's just physics.
Good highlight reel.
Yeah, but there were a couple other plays where that same kid shot out, and Dante spent a bunch of time watching the Bosa's on YouTube, learned how to hand fight, just swipe both the hands aside, shot past the guy, and sacked the quarterback. So, you know, like that's the great thing about athletics. You can get your ass kicked someplace, but if you got the attitude, you can get back up, figure out how to make it work. And so that's a journey that he's just starting, and where that goes, like, you know, who knows?
Yeah.
But that's, you know, you can't be unmoored from reality. But nothing used to fire me up more than having someone tell me I can't do it, because I'm just going to fucking prove you wrong.
Right. I think that's a great attitude in sports that comes out. That is you know, you talk about sports being a vehicle for learning, essentially. And that's one of the things that I think is phenomenal about sports, is it teaches you, or it gives you an opportunity to set that mindset. And that's very critical in life, I think. Taking that attitude rather than, you know, I'm a victim to whatever my particular skill set is, you know.
Or worse, whatever other people are saying about you, which is the hardest thing in today's day and age. I don't know how kids manage through this process with, you know, the Twitter and all the different social medias that are out there. Like, it would drive me crazy. And so you got to be able to tune that stuff out, right? You got to just, and I would also say, and coaches will say this in a backhanded way, like, you can't measure heart, and that's true. But what they never talk about is the application of the mind. Like, the greatest athletic gift people have, and they don't talk about it, is your mind. If you want to know why Jordan was Jordan, it's because at the end of the day, he just is like, I am going to figure out how to destroy the person on the other side. There were people who were as tall as he was, or as fast as he was. Did he have physical gifts? Sure. But you talk to anybody who had to go against him, and they don't talk about that. It was just the mindset. And I don't think we spend enough time as parents pouring into our kids about how they can steal their mind, not just to defend against all the inputs and all the crap that comes their way on social media, and teammates and parents on sidelines, and, oh, and my kid heard from, you know, Alabama. Like, it's all garbage, right? That, you got to block that stuff out. But even more than that, it's the application of the mind to, okay, hey, Dante, you're 6'2", you're maybe 240 pounds now. You're going against this left tackle. How are you going to beat him? And I don't have to ask him that. He spends a bunch of time thinking, I don't want to get my ass kicked. So how do I take the gifts that I have, and maximize my strengths and minimize my weaknesses? And that is using the brain to outthink your opponent. And that is the other aspect of the control of the mind that is so critical as you try and jump levels from grade school to middle school, from middle school to high school, from high school to, you know, elite club teams, to Division I to pro. Like, the two things that every sport has in common: the speed of the game increases dramatically. The guys in the NFL are not bigger than the guys in college. They're just faster. But they think faster. And that's the other aspect. And the way you can neutralize physical speed of your opponent is to outthink what they're going to do and be a step ahead of them. And that's the other key.
Yeah. Should we get
That's a great point. Yep.
Yeah. Kind of back to the question earlier that I had, you know, with the recruiting approach you took with Dagny and swimming, being very, like, analytical, objective, I guess you said is a great word for it. How did you find the recruiting process was with Deacon, and having a sport that is a lot more subjective, that, you know, it's much more difficult to distinguish players?
Yeah. So this will be a short conversation. There was no recruiting process.
Hmm.
He was not recruited by anybody. So, Deacon's story is very different. So, love sports. He played football, baseball, like, in this town where we grew up, which is lacrosse every town, and baseball and lacrosse are, rival sports. He was a pitcher. He loved pitching, but his heart is in lacrosse. He playing both sports, I think, up until 8th grade, which was like, at one point, the lacrosse mafia here in town was like, we're going to have to kick your kid out because, like, we need the commitment. But, for Deacon, like, look, the way I would describe it is this. He loved lacrosse, and lacrosse is a thinking man's game. I'll never forget, we sat in our garage after he came back sophomore year, 3 days of tryouts for varsity for the local, high school lacrosse team. And he was at that point, I think it was 5'10", 137 pounds. He probably killed me for not a hair on his body. He'd probably kill me for telling you that. But the point there was he just was never going to get the opportunity. And so I asked him about the 3 days of tryouts, and he was a defender. And he's got 200-pound attackmen. They're full-grown men. They're whatever. And he's like, Dad, I literally had 3 plays out of 3 days. Like they clearly were never looking at him.
Right.
And he was lucky enough as a sophomore to make the JV team. Like he got a spot, and that was not guaranteed either, because there are a lot of people trying out for all these high school teams. And so we sat in the garage, and I said, well, so what do you think? And to his great credit, he just, he came up with a plan. And what I told him was, I said, there's not, with your mother's height and my height, there's not a chance that you're going to graduate from high school and you're going to be any less than 6'3", and that's plenty enough size to play, Division I lacrosse. So, excuse me. Let's be clear. He just wanted to make the varsity team. And
Right.
so I said, plenty enough time. And I said, you're fast. You're not necessarily quick, but you're fast enough to play as well. So you're going to grow into your body. Your time hasn't come yet. So what's going to be your plan? How are you going to do it? And the first choice that he had to make is a 5'10", 137-pound kid. His coaches were like, you need to play short stick defensive midfield. Now, y'all don't know the game. The great irony in that is Deacon's skills was he knew how to think the game. He was technically very good with the stick. He had great anticipation. What he was lacking was the physicality. But he was a phenomenal lacrosse player, and he knew how to think the game. So he was quite evolved in that regard. But the feedback from his coaches, who are looking at his measurables, were like, you're 5'10", 137 pounds. We need a short stick defensive midfielder. That's a position you got to go play. And he wanted to play, defense. The great irony is, and this is where knowing the game helped, your best athlete is going to play short stick defensive midfield. Like if Deion Sanders played lacrosse, they would make him a short stick defensive midfield. He would shut down the opposing player's best, the opposing team's best player. He wouldn't need a big 6-foot stick because he had all the quickness in the world. He would depossess the ball, pick it up, go down and score. Like that's where you put your best athletes. And Deacon was arguably, at least from measurables, the worst athlete on the team. So the first decision that he had to make was actually to not listen to the coaches.
Right.
And so he turned up for his first JV practice and he said, hey, coach, I know what you said, but I'm committed to playing close defense. And I don't want to play short stick defensive midfield. And like all good high school coaches, his response was, I can't tell you no, but you're never going to play.
Yeah.
That's your choice, Deacon. If you don't want to play where I want you to play, then I'm just going to tell you you're never going to play.
Yeah.
And he had the stones to look the coach in the eye and say, hey, coach, that's what I'm committed to, and that's what I'm doing. Because he had a plan on where he was going to go. He wasn't making a decision for that week or that month or that year around whether he was going to get a couple runs on a JV level. He had a plan around where he thought he could go. So this is punching through that ceiling that we were just talking about.
Right.
He had a plan to punch through not just the ceiling, but like the next 10 floors. And that he had to have the belief to stick with that plan because that plan made sense for him. So he had to block everything else out and just start at the bottom of the totem pole, at the JV level that year. And the short story is halfway through the season, they were like, well, he can actually catch and throw and he's good at lacrosse. And, we don't really want him out there, but we're going to put him out there. And then somebody got injured or somebody got a girlfriend or got, on probation for picking up a pack of smokes or whatever the shit is that happens in high school. And then he got on the field. And then his skill started showing. Then he started to grow a little bit. And by the end of the season, he was sort of, there was a big varsity tournament where they took him up to Boston. And he was the last guy, and it's because the JV coach was like, look, he was talking to the high school coach. He's like, look, this is the kid. Like, if you're going to take 5 kids and you don't take this kid, like, you're making a massive mistake. And his JV coach totally advocated for him. And just going on that trip was enough to give Deacon that little bit of confidence to say the plan's working.
Right.
And then, of course, over the summer,
grows like 6 inches.
I apologize, but I got to just share this story. So over the summer, he popped to 6'3", and he walks back into high school, and one of the varsity coaches was also the substitute chemistry teacher, and Deacon was at like AP chemistry, so he's got all the squids in the class, and you got this JV lacrosse or this assistant lacrosse coach who was substitute teaching AP physics on the first day of school, which is saying Deacon walks in, and the teacher just looks at him, he's like, holy shit, dude, look at you. Like, he completely popped. And all these squiddy, like, AP, physics students are like, what is going on here? Anyway, so he started growing to his body. But at that point, even though lacrosse was a spring sport, he had now started to grow, like, all the recruiting was done. Like, before he even laced him up for his junior year, all the Division I slots were gone because that's the way the recruiting works.
Yeah.
And that was a little bit of a bummer. And then when he made varsity his junior year, he was the 10th of 10 defensemen. And by the start of the season, because he could catch and throw, he got onto the field and he started playing. He ended up starting that season. He muscled his way onto the field. But there were no more Division I slots. And so we were talking about it. He had gone to the Army lacrosse camps as a 6th and 7th grader. He got to know the coach, from our hometown back up in Auburn, New York. He just stayed with it, and he just focused on becoming the best player he could. And it turned out that Army had recruited another kid on Deacon's team. It turned out, his best friend, Jackson Tyler, who was a great high school athlete. Coach came down at the end of the spring season his junior year, because they got it at West Point. Like, it's not just enough to recruit and get the commitments, but once they get on the radar, like, all the Ivies are like smart enough to get into an academic school, and we can just go market against, hey man, you don't want to pick up a rifle and charge a machine gun nest 5 years after you graduate. Why don't you come out over here? And so Army does an incredible job of finding the right sorts of people, and Jackson was fully committed, but they also know they gotta nurture the relationship.
Defend the position.
Yeah, so he defend the hill. So he came down, he got a look at Deacon, and that just was enough to just be like, wow, there should be something to do here. He heard nothing from anyone. And I would say once they won the state championship his junior year, and he had an incredible season. And so I think for Deacon, he had scratched the itch that he had always had, which he just wanted to play for his local, varsity team. Once he got all the way through that on the junior year, as is natural with athletes, he said, okay, what's the next level and how do I get there? And so for him, it was all about, well, okay, you've got the academics, and he was fortunate enough to have very strong academics. How do we circumvent the traditional recruiting process, the summer leagues, the elite teams, all the guys that got recruited early on, and find those 1 or 2 slots that may or may be available because somebody who committed to Georgetown or UVA or wherever, decommitted and went somewhere else. That was the game that he was playing. And so, again, we had to be very intentional and try and reach out to some of the coaches. The local high school coach, Jim Davidson, was great, trying to get Deacon on the radar. It just, the way it worked out is it just didn't, we didn't find a hole. And ultimately, he was recruited to West Point from an academic standpoint because he'd been on campus. They knew that he, had good SATs and the like. He'd gotten into Georgetown. Georgetown has a very good lacrosse program. They had recruited a kid from the next town over to play defense that Deacon and his team beat in the state championship along the way. And so Deacon was like, I've got the confidence to know that I can play with all these guys. He could never find his opportunity. And I would say what worked for him was he never gave in to the, you're not going to make it talk.
Right.
That was the hardest thing for his journey, is he never stopped believing in his plan when any rational parent or person would sit there and say, hey man, let's figure out how to go, do keg stands at, wherever, whatever school it is, and go have a good time. And because he had the passion and the desire, our job as his parents were to nurture that and protect him from all the externalities and allow him the time to keep going and keep developing. Because as one of the coaches said, look, we love him. He's a Division I lacrosse player. He's just not a Division I athlete. And the reality, Joel, back to the question you asked, like you talk about incremental growth. Our feedback to him is, you're not going to stop growing and you're not going to stop developing physically when you get into college. So why should you give up on your dreams when you know that your best days are still ahead of you, and you got the passion and you got the skill? And so for him, the trick there was just keeping an open mind, and he had to make a commitment. He had to decide whether he was going to go to West Point. And so lacrosse was not a feature. I mean, he had a great senior season, and the whole thing was not a feature until late June. And he had to let the academy know by, I think it was like June 20th, what he was going to do. And his choices were, depending on when the Ivies were going to come through. He was still, talking to Harvard, but he had an opportunity to go to Georgetown, which is a great school. But it was very clear the coach had no interest in talking to him, wouldn't even take a meeting. Or
Really?
Or he could go to UC Berkeley, which he loved. He went out and looked at Stanford and Berkeley from an academic standpoint, which is gorgeous. Those schools are great. And he was all about the Berkeley experience and the academics. He was a heavy math guy, but it was a club scene, and it would have been great, and it would have been an awesome experience for him. Let's not talk about COVID, but he still wanted to be Division I player. And then it was literally 5 days before he had to let West Point know what he was going to do. Coach called him and said, "Look, I can't guarantee anything, but what I can tell you is I'll give you a walk-on slot. I may have to tell you a week after you start that it's not going to work out, but if you want a shot, I'll give you a shot." And that was just enough for him to say, okay, he was already through the academy, and there's a lot that goes into a service academy, and it's not for everybody, but I would also say it's an extraordinary experience. And we're exceptionally proud of what he did. To have nothing to do with lacrosse, like what he's done there. But it was just enough for him to say, okay, then maybe this is my shot and I'm going to go take it. And he took it.
Right.
And then he ended up being a 2-year starter and had a great career.
So that June 20th was the June 20th of his senior year.
He had already graduated high school.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So graduated.
No, he literally, he was 10 days away from having his head shaved and reporting, or kicking it in Berkeley and becoming a math guy and doing some club lacrosse and having the California experience. And when I look at Joel's hair, I'm like, that's the California experience right there, right? Like that. He could have been you, Joel.
He could have been me.
Exactly. But he took a different path. Yeah, it was super, super late. None of this happened. There were a couple D3 schools I think were maybe interested. He had no interest in doing that. He knew what he wanted from an academic standpoint. He wanted a large school. He was hoping to find a great, a football program, like a UCLA or whatever, Texas or whatever. But he wanted to play Division I lacrosse. And I would say if there was a lesson here, it was he never stopped believing. And our job as his parents were not to tell him he couldn't do it. Okay, what's your plan? What are you doing? How do we make this work? Mm-hmm. And that involved a lot of blocking out everything else.
Wow.
That's I love that story. I mean, it's so great because particularly in lacrosse, my experience was, and our second son Bowden he played lacrosse in middle school and actually went to a big lacrosse prep school. And some of these kids were getting offers, and obviously it's changed now, but some of these kids are getting offers at such a young age. And, you know, knowing you're going to Duke to play lacrosse when you're in eighth grade or freshman year of high school can be a really bad thing. It's like, holy smokes, like I've got my future figured out. I can go do whatever I want, as long as I just don't screw it up, and I don't know that that's good. But on the flip side, I feel like Deacon's experience, is such a great opportunity for him to maximize his skill set, but also just dealing with life. Sometimes you don't know until 5 days before you got to make a decision on something like that, and it can be a huge impact. And so that's such a cool story, and I love it. And
I mean, just listening to the story, it sounded remarkably similar to my story, actually, my senior year, because I mean, we had, he made a decision 5 days before he had to. I made my decision. The Pepperdine baseball coach, or one of them, came to see me pitch and said basically the same thing as what he told Deacon. If he said, I can offer you a walk-on spot. Who knows what'll happen? I mean, I remember my assistant coach saw me throw a bullpen for like 10, 15 pitches, and he was like, yeah, sure, you can come in and compete for innings. And I was like, okay, cool. And then yeah, the day came where we had to make a deposit for tuition for whatever school I was going to in the fall. And yeah, and then I called him up during my lunch period and I said, hey, I'd love to come. And he was like, okay, cool. And yeah, I don't know. It felt like his story has a lot of parallels with my story, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think that the lessons, either Gunnar from yours or Deacon's or whatever, but back to Joel's point, look, the downside of getting the Duke offer is you now got teenagers, let alone eighth or ninth graders, who are now orienting their life on what somebody else thinks of them.
right.
And that is an express train to long-term unhappiness. That is the worst lesson in life that you can learn. If you spend your days worried, if your self-worth is attached to what other people think of you, you are going to be unhappy long-term. The
Right.
only way to find happiness, and this is why we got kids into sports in the first place, is to find that self-belief. And so, Gunnar, when you were talking about your story and your decision, and you were the one in control and taking the flyer, you knew what the odds were. Like, that decision ultimately was yours. It was not somebody else's. And it's almost harder for the kids and the parents of kids where the things come easy and all the bullshit that comes on with it. Come here and he's gonna run first line midfield, or he's gonna be QB2 as a freshman, or whatever the stuff is that gets said in the recruiting process, which is you got to go through it. But if your North Star when you go through that recruiting process isn't, hey, what does my kid really want and what's best for them, and judge other people based on them so that the kid is making the decision, not the other way around, you're almost invariably going to end up in a bad situation because you made your decisions based on what other people thought and not what you thought.
Right.
If Dion's listening to this, I'm sure he didn't have this. None of this will be applicable to him. I mean, I guess he's through his recruiting process, but that's the exception. And if you're looking for life lessons, you don't make judgments based on how to deal with the exception. You gotta come up with your rules. You want to be in control, and you want your kids to feel empowered, because I don't care what their process is, they're gonna go through bad days. And if things came easy, the biggest challenge for them is how do they get back up, and that's why you got into sports in the first place. And if you want to know why they changed the recruiting rules on the lacrosse side, a lot of those ninth grade kids who were getting recruited as eighth and ninth graders did not pan out.
Yeah.
And they did not pan out because in ninth grade that were walking around school with their Duke sweatshirt on, like I'm the guy. And guess what? You can't tell those kids anything. Like they knew everything to begin with. Then once they got that scholarship at a school that's arguably better than the academic place that mom and dad went to, good luck trying to parent them, right?
Yeah.
Unless
Yeah.
you were grounded in the first place, and nothing is given in life. And so, you know, those are the lessons that you want to learn. And the recruiting process, I've only gone through it once, even though there are two kids that, you know, went on the journey, but it's got to be oriented around what's best for the kid. Otherwise, I think you're asking for trouble.
That's again, well said, Bruce. Although you're preaching to the choir, because I'm a believer in that the Deion Sanders situation is totally the exception, but that is what parents hear. That's what the media is covering. Quite frankly, that's one of the reasons we started this whole podcast, is so that people hear stories that are not the exception, that are the norm. And the norm is that it's not easy. And there's a lot of bad things or a lot of difficult times, frustrations that lead to good things, right? And so I think that's one of the best things about the whole process. And, you know, you say that Deacon wasn't recruited, but at the end of the day, you're talking about the whole process. Everyone was aware of his lacrosse ability, shall we say. So the recruitment process isn't always, you know, everybody loves you. Sometimes it's people see you and, you know, they're like, yeah, you know, Gunnar had a situation. He went to Stanford, wanted Gunnar to come do a showcase at their school, and, you know, it didn't go well, you know, and they're like, you know, just go radio silent. They ghosted him after that, you know, and so, you know, we all have experiences like that, and you have to be able to manage it as a kid, but also parents saying, hey, you know, that's actually normal. It's not exceptional, you know. So
yeah,
well
for me, that's the job of the parent. Look, the number one job is, if your kid is playing a sport, and unless they have jumped to the point where they're like, I'm just playing to better my life, get an opportunity that I wouldn't otherwise have, which is not usually the conversation parents are having with kids, then your sole job is just to protect your child from all the negativity that can come as a part of this very exposed process.
right.
And, you know, you got social media, and now with NIL, it's almost like, oh, there's an open market, right? We know what our value is. It's all garbage. What it doesn't measure is, it doesn't measure heart, it doesn't measure intellect, and the desire to be better.
Right.
And so I think as parents, our job in recruiting is no different than our job in life, which is just to protect our kids and make sure they're grounded, that they're happy, that they're clear-minded around what they're doing. And if the odds are long, who fucking cares, right? That's not a bad decision, so long as they go into their eyes open. The flip side is even harder. When the doors start opening, do we give up our kids' happiness because, you know, UVA came in over Duke, which just got in over Harvard, which like help the child figure out what it is they want, and let the process work for them. Don't let them get worked by the process.
Right. It's interesting you bring that up, because one of the prior episodes we just did was with Steve Daniels, whose son was JT Daniels, was Gatorade Player of the Year, and nationally, I believe, and then California State Player of the Year 2 years in a row. And he was just talking about how, you know, it's hard not to drink the Kool-Aid as a parent, you know, and you're drinking the Kool-Aid, and I think you end up making decisions that are based on as you said, other people's opinion of your kid rather than what's best for the kid long term. And so that's a great insight, to be focused on who you are and what you as a child, and what the parents view, how the parents view the child as, you know, what are your goals, and how do your talents line up with those goals, and how do we get there, you know? And it's a very different conversation. So that's awesome.
Well, I'm not a baseball guy, but it probably is the most evolved of all the sports. But what they say about baseball guys is if you got the talent, they're going to find you. Like
Yeah.
there's not a lot of linear paths to the bigs. But if you can bring it, if you can sling that leather,
Yeah.
they're going to find you.
Yeah. Yeah. That I don't know. That's very much the case. You see that a lot with all the high school guys that get drafted now because I mean,